Hey guys, tonight we wander back through the mist of 1,000 forgotten mornings to a time when kings slept in stone and the wind itself carried the echo of war horns. You're standing on a damp, grassy hill, your boots sinking slightly into the mud. In the distance, the first light of dawn leaks through the fog, and there it is, your first sight of a medieval castle. Not a romantic fairy tale palace, but a hulking, gray, muscle-built structure meant to intimidate, endure, and, frankly, survive things you probably wouldn't. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it for you? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air smells of damp earth and moss. As you gaze up, the castle feels alive, its jagged silhouette framed against the waking sky. Its turrets like watchful eyes. These weren't just houses. They were statements of dominance. You can try, the stones seem to say, but you'll never get in. The first castles were born not from vanity, but necessity. After the fall of Rome, chaos flooded Europe like a broken dam. Kings needed order, knights needed shelter, and peasants needed anyone who could protect them from the next invading army or wandering bandit gang. So they built Bailey castles, wooden towers perched atop artificial hills, surrounded by ditches. It was like a medieval version of moving into a house made of cardboard and saying, "Don't worry, it's temporary." But it worked, for a while, until the first angry neighbor with a torch showed up. Then stone took over. Strong, heavy, unburnable stone. By the 11th century, castles began to look like the ones in your imagination: thick walls, arrow slits, moats, and that towering central keep like a clenched fist rising above the landscape. You step closer, the ground turning from grass to gravel. The morning fog curls around your legs like a ghost dog. You imagine masons working here 800 years ago, hauling limestone blocks up crude scaffolding, singing off-key songs about ale and aching backs. Each stone laid by hand, each corner measured by an instinct older than blueprints. Historians still argue whether castles began as purely military bases or as power symbols, first defense or dominance. The truth, as usual, is both. A castle wasn't just a shield, it was a billboard, a medieval flex. Lords didn't just build castles to keep enemies out. They built them to remind everyone inside who the boss was. And yet, you'd be surprised by how quiet they could feel. Inside the walls, you might hear nothing but the creak of timber, the flap of a banner, maybe the faint drip of rainwater sneaking through a crack. No engines, no hum of electricity, just the occasional scream of a gull and the groan of the wind. You move toward the outer wall. It's rough under your fingertips, cold, like it's holding 1,000 winters in its skin. You try to imagine what it cost, not in gold, but in time, sweat, and broken bones. Some castles took decades to finish. Others never really finished at all. They kept growing, adapting, rebuilding after every siege, like living creatures patching up scars. One quirky thing most people don't know: castle builders often reused ancient Roman ruins nearby. Whole sections of fortress walls were cobbled together from old temples, amphitheaters, even gravestones. Somewhere inside that fortress, a Roman soldier's epitaph might now be part of a staircase, recycling medieval style. And as you stand there, a question hums through your head. How did they decide where to build them? You'll notice they're always on high ground, near rivers or trade routes. That wasn't just for scenic views. It was pure strategy. Height gave vision, rivers gave power, and roads brought wealth. A castle was never random, it was geometry with fangs. Your eyes drift to the battlements, and you can almost see it, the banner of a forgotten lord flapping lazily, the sun turning the gray stone gold. A few guards in chainmail shift from foot to foot, bored but alert. You'd think they had an easy job, but remember back then, a quiet day could turn into an invasion by lunch. Inside, life was as brutal as it was beautiful. Lords ruled, knights trained, servants scurried, and everyone smelled faintly of smoke and mutton. It was a contained world, a miniature city, designed not just for defense, but for control. You could say a castle was the medieval version of a social network. It connected everyone, but only if you were on the right side of the walls. You walk around the outer curtain wall, noticing arrow slits so narrow they look like sneers carved into the stone. Every line here serves purpose. Every shadow hides intent. Castles weren't just built, they were engineered emotions. Fear, awe, respect. You were meant to feel small here. Still, there's beauty in that symmetry, stone blocks, aligned with eerie perfection. Towers rising like exclamation marks against the horizon. Some say these fortresses were humanity's first skyscrapers, reaching not for heaven, but for power. And maybe that's the strange genius of them. They were built for survival, yet became symbols of pride. A crow lands on the wall, caws once, and disappears into the fog. You smile faintly. Somehow, 8 centuries later, the castle still works. You feel exactly what its builder wanted you to feel, odd, cautious, curious. And as the first drops of rain begin to fall, you glance up at those ancient stones and realize something simple but humbling. You are standing inside someone else's dream of immortality. The rain thickens into a fine mist as you approach the drawbridge. The wood beneath your feet groans softly, the smell of wet oak and iron chains heavy in the air. Ahead of you, the castle's mouth yawns open, a dark, arched gateway flanked by towers that seem to breathe out cold air like dragons. Welcome to the place where visitors are tested, intruders are trapped, and overconfidence is the fastest way to die before breakfast. The moat below you isn't the clean blue water of storybooks. It's murky, greenish, alive with algae, frogs, and possibly a few unfortunate things that once tried to swim. You peer over the edge and catch a faint whiff. Yeah, not perfume. In truth, many moats weren't deep at all. They were often swampy ditches filled with rainwater and waste. But that was the point. Try charging across that in 50 pounds of armor, while people throw rocks and insults at you from above. And then there's the drawbridge, the medieval version of a do not disturb sign. When pulled up, it sealed the entrance, forming part of the wall itself. The mechanism was deceptively simple. Huge chains wound around wooden drums, operated by hand cranks inside the gatehouse. When attackers tried to break it, defenders could drop it like a hammer. Some castles even designed the bridge to snap in half if forced, plunging unlucky soldiers into the moat below. You probably wouldn't survive that, not because of the fall, but because of what came next. As you pass under the gate arch, the atmosphere changes. The outside world vanishes, replaced by the deep echo of dripping water and your own footsteps. Above you looms one of the castle's most brilliant and cruel inventions, the murder hole. It's not a metaphor, it's literally a hole in the ceiling, right above where you're standing. Through it, defenders could pour boiling water, oil, or sand, or drop stones, spears, and if they were in a creative mood, beehives. Imagine fighting for your life and suddenly being attacked by bees wearing chainmail. Not ideal. Historians still argue whether boiling oil was actually used, since it was expensive and valuable. More likely, it was boiling water or quicklime, that chalky powder that burns skin and blinds eyes. Either way, it worked. The gatehouse became a blender of misery for anyone foolish enough to rush through. You take a step forward, running your hand along the grooves of the iron portcullis, that heavy, gridded gate that could drop in an instant. The spikes at its base gleam faintly. You imagine it slamming down with a metallic scream, cutting off escape, pinning a man to the ground like a butterfly on a collector's board. But it wasn't just for show. Many castles had multiple portcullises, spaced to trap enemies in a confined space. A killing zone. Once trapped, you couldn't move forward or back, and the murder holes above would do their work. Yet, in this cruel efficiency, there's genius. Every inch of the gatehouse was designed to waste time, to turn momentum into panic. The longer an invading army lingered here, the more arrows, rocks, and creative fluids they'd endure. You glance up at the towers flanking the gatehouse. They curve inward slightly, not for aesthetics, but so defenders could shoot down along the walls. Those little arrow slits you saw earlier, they're masterpieces of medieval geometry, wide on the inside, narrow on the outside. That design let archers aim across wide angles while staying nearly invisible. You could be 10 feet from the wall and still not spot the archer aiming straight at you. One quirky fact: in some later castles, engineers built fake arrow slits, purely decorative ones, just to make the fortress look more intimidating. It's like medieval Photoshop. Your foot hits a patch of slick stone, and you instinctively grab the wall. The stones feel damp, but not soft. Centuries of footsteps have worn the floor smooth. You picture an army of muddy boots thundering in, the crash of shields, the panicked shouts as the portcullis drops behind them. The design didn't just protect, it manipulated human fear. Historians still debate whether the moat and drawbridge were more symbolic than functional, a psychological trick as much as a physical barrier. After all, no soldier enjoys charging through mud under a rain of arrows. But sometimes, just believing something was impenetrable was enough to make it so. You emerge from the gatehouse into the inner courtyard, breathing out a little sigh of relief. The light feels warmer here, though the air still tastes of stone. Chickens peck at the dirt. A blacksmith hammers in the distance. Somewhere, a dog barks, not in alarm, just out of habit. For the first time, you feel the dual nature of the castle, both fortress and village, danger and home. You glance back at the entrance and realize how narrow it seems now, framed by its twin towers and iron teeth. You just walked through a masterpiece of layered fear. The medieval mind didn't rely on luck. It relied on calculation, design, and a very sharp understanding of human stupidity. And you can't help but smile at the absurdity of it all. They built entire architectural systems just to stop people from visiting uninvited. Kind of like the world's most aggressive, no soliciting sign. But the real brilliance, the Castle's defenses, Warren T, meant to stop a single attack. They were meant to stop the idea of an attack. Most enemies gave up before even reaching this point. The moat, the portcullis, the murder holes, they all whispered the same thing into an invader's mind. Don't bother. You take one last look at the damp gateway behind you. The chains creak softly in the wind, the drawbridge swaying just slightly. Beyond it, the world feels far away. Inside, everything is controlled, planned, safe for now. And as the rain fades to drizzle, you realize you've crossed not just a bridge, but a threshold between two worlds, one of chaos and one of cunning order. The courtyard mud squelches softly under your boots as you move deeper into the fortress. The drizzle lingers, tracing dark veins across the stone. Before you looms the wall, massive, silent, and impossibly patient. You tilt your head back, tracing its climb toward the clouds. This isn't just a barrier. It's a language of war, written in limestone and fear. You walk closer, running your hand across the stonework. It feels rough and uneven in places, almost like scar tissue. Because that's what it is, centuries of repairs, burns, and rebuilds layered together. Medieval castle walls weren't made of one smooth slab. They were built in 3 layers, 2 solid outer faces of dressed stone and a rubble core in between. The rubble wasn't random, it absorbed shock. When catapult stones smashed into it, the energy dispersed rather than cracking straight through. It's like medieval bubble wrap, only heavier and far less fun to pop. Historians still argue whether these breathing walls evolved from Roman engineering or if they were a uniquely medieval innovation born of necessity. But one thing's clear, they were alive in their own way. They shifted, groaned, expanded with the seasons. You can almost feel the weight of centuries pressing outward and inward, stone against earth, earth against time. You step back, noticing how the wall isn't a perfect rectangle, it curves slightly, wrapping the courtyard like a protective arm. That wasn't a mistake. Curved walls deflected siege projectiles better than flat ones. Every inch was a calculated defense. Even the towers were placed at angles that allowed overlapping fields of fire, so no blind spot remained. You realize the castle isn't just a building, it's geometry at war with mortality. A flicker of movement catches your eye. On the parapet above, a raven hops along the merlons, the notched battlements, shaped like jagged teeth. Each gap, called a crenel, let defenders shoot arrows safely. You imagine a row of archers lined up there centuries ago, ducking and firing in a deadly rhythm. Step, draw, release, duck. Like music, if music could kill. The air smells faintly of ash. Somewhere nearby, a fire burns in a blacksmith's forge. The sound blends with the memory of siege engines creaking, the thunk of catapult stones slamming against these very walls. You glance at the mortar lines between the stones and spot odd, shapestiny bits of shell, bone, and pottery embedded inside. that's no accident either. Builders sometimes mixed animal blood or crushed shells into mortar for strength. Whether it worked scientifically or just spiritually, no one really knows. But maybe the walls held because people believed they would. And belief was the strongest mortar of all. You trace your way along the base of the wall, where the stones grow massive, some the size of coffins. Each block had to be quarried, shaped, and dragged by oxen. It could take months to raise a section the height of a man, and yet they did it over and over, generation after generation. The sheer human persistence seeps from every surface. You notice the wall's lower edge flares outward slightly, forming a slope. That's called a batter, designed so projectiles and ladders would slide off instead of biting in. You try to imagine climbing it while people above throw rocks and sarcastic comments. You probably wouldn't make it 10 feet. The genius wasn't just in thickness, it was in layering. Castles like Crackday Chevaliers or Dover were built in concentric rings, each wall nested within another. If attackers breached the first, they'd face a second, higher one looming like a smirking older brother. Nice try, the stone seemed to whisper, but we've got layers. One quirky fact: in some places, engineers built walls thick enough to include rooms inside them. Tiny spiral staircases wound through the stone, connecting towers and chambers invisibly. Some guards even slept inside the wall itself, cocooned in limestone. Imagine the silence, your heartbeat echoing against rock that's seen 1,000 storms. You stop beneath a high tower, staring at its narrow slit windows. The slits aren't symmetrical. They angled downward and sideways, so defenders could rain arrows on anyone approaching the base. From outside, they look decorative. From inside, they're instruments. The view through one must have been unnerving, teeny slices of the world framed by death. Historians still argue how much artistic intention went into this symmetry of violence. Were these walls designed to intimidate, or did beauty just emerge naturally from efficiency? Whatever the truth, standing here, you feel both intimidation and awe, entwined like vines on the stone. A drop of rain lands on your face, cold and deliberate. You look up at the battlements again. For all their might, the walls couldn't stop time. Moss creeps through cracks, ivy coils across forgotten corners, and in the quiet, it's almost like the fortress is exhaling. There's something profoundly human about that, isn't there? These walls were built to keep the world out, but now, centuries later, the world has gently crept back in, leaf by leaf, drop by drop. You take a slow breath, tasting the damp air. Somewhere beyond these defenses, a storm gathers over the hills. You imagine lightning striking the tallest tower, thunder rolling across the valley like an ancient drum. The castle doesn't flinch. It never did. You rest your palm flat against the wall one last time, and for a heartbeat, you swear it feels warm. Maybe it's the trapped heat of the day, or maybe it's the memory of the hundreds of hands that built it, defended it, and died beneath it. Either way, it's alive enough. And as you pull your hand away, you realize something quietly astonishing. These walls didn't just survive wars, they survived the end of the world that built them. The rain finally fades, leaving the stones slick and glistening like wet armor. You walk slowly toward the gatehouse tower that looms ahead, its shadow cutting across the courtyard like a warning. The walls around you tighten, the path narrowing, funneling you toward a single massive doorway. You realize something unsettling. This is no ordinary entrance. This is a trap disguised as hospitality. The gatehouse was the castle's welcome mat of death. From a distance, it looks grand. Thick walls, tall towers, iron teeth of the portcullis gleaming faintly. But up close, it feels like walking into a mouth designed to chew you up. You hesitate at the threshold, sensing how every inch of this place was built to turn an attack into panic. You step under the archway. Instantly, the air cools, the light dims. The sound of your boots echoes in a hollow rhythm that feels uncomfortably loud. Overhead, the ceiling stretches into shadow, where hidden openings, those infamous murder holes, again wait patiently. You remember the last time you passed through one, but here it's worse. The corridor ahead is longer, narrower, flanked by thick oak doors, reinforced with iron. If attackers ever reached this far, defenders would trap them here, raise the portcullis behind, drop another in front, and lock them into a stone throat. Then the ceiling would open, and everything unpleasant that could be poured, dropped, or launched would be water, rocks, arrows, fire, and sometimes bees. Because yes, medieval defenders really did use beehives. Imagine surviving a siege only to be stung into submission. Historians still argue whether some of the more extreme tactics, like molten lead, were actually used or were just psychological myths spread to terrify enemies. But either way, it worked. The gatehouse was a horror story you could walk into. You move forward carefully, your eyes adjusting to the dim light. The floor slopes slightly upward, forcing you to lean forward, a subtle trick that made attackers slow down, stumble, and lose momentum. You run your hand along the wall and find it strangely smooth. That's because guards used to oil it, so invaders couldn't grip or climb if they broke through the first barrier. And then there are the arrow loops, thin, vertical slits running along both sides. You peek through one and catch a flash of the courtyard outside, but from the other side, it's invisible. Defenders could stand there safely, firing arrows through the gaps at anyone trapped below. It's like being shot at by ghosts. The genius here isn't just in the materials, it's in the choreography. A castle gatehouse wasn't just a structure, it was a stage, with the defenders as performers in a deadly dance. Everyone knew their part. The portcullis men cranked, the archers fired, the engineers poured, and above it all, the Lord might stand at the upper window, watching the chaos unfold like an unpleasant but necessary ritual. You stop beneath a massive beam. Its iron brackets look ancient, scarred by age and fire. This would have held the drawbridge chain, wound by human strength alone. Imagine the sound of it lowering groaning gears, the crash of wood meeting stone, the echo booming across the moat. The bridge would drop, the soldiers would march, and in that one sound, that single wooden thunk, you'd hear the heartbeat of a medieval fortress. And then, once it rose again, silence, just wind whistling through the archways, and a few nervous pigeons, wondering why humans were so dramatic. You step out into a side corridor, curious. The air smells faintly of smoke and damp straw. A spiral staircase coils upward, impossibly narrow. You grip the stone center column as you climb. The stairs twist clockwise. That's not random. It gave right-handed defenders above the advantage to swing swords freely, while attackers climbing upward had their sword arms pinned against the wall. Smart, right? Unless you're left-handed, then congratulations, you're suddenly valuable in medieval warfare. You emerge onto a small platform overlooking the entrance. From here, you can see the entire killing zone below, the perfect vantage point for an archer or a boiling oil enthusiast. You can almost feel the ghostly presence of guards who once stood here, whispering jokes to each other between volleys. And yet, in this grim efficiency, there's beauty, too. The sunlight filters through slits in perfect geometry, scattering thin ribbons of gold onto the gray stone. You catch yourself admiring it, how light and death coexist so elegantly here. One quirky fact: some castles built false gatehouses, decorative entrances that went nowhere just to confuse attackers. They'd waste precious time battering a wall that didn't even lead inside, while the real entrance sat quietly somewhere else, smirking. Medieval architects didn't just build fortresses, they built illusions. You descend again, stepping back into the main passage. The floor is littered with tiny pebbles washed in by the rain, crunching softly underfoot. You pause halfway through and look back the way you came. The portcullis hangs above like a silent predator, and for a second you feel what invaders must have felt, that mix of awe and dread, the realization that the very walls around you were thinking. Historians still debate whether these designs were standardized or improvised, but one thing's certain: no two gatehouses were ever identical. Each was a unique expression of paranoia and pride. As you finally step into the open air again, the courtyard feels brighter than before, almost welcoming. You inhale deeply, letting the scent of wet stone and wood fill your lungs. The gatehouse behind you looms like a warning, its shadows stretching long across the ground. You smile faintly. It's strange, isn't it? The most beautiful thing about a castle is also its most deadly. That perfect symmetry where art meets anxiety and architecture becomes psychology. Somewhere above, a bell rings deep, slow, and resonant. It vibrates through the stones, through your ribs, reminding you that this fortress isn't just built to fight enemies outside. It's built to discipline the chaos within. And as the echo fades, you realize, in the medieval world, safety always had teeth. The spiral staircase seems endless as you ascend, each step echoing softly in the narrow shaft. You're climbing toward the heart of the castle, the Great Keep. Up here, the air is cooler, tinged with stone dust and the faint scent of old fires. The wind whips around the battlements, tugging at your coat and carrying the distant bleat of sheep from the valley below. Every step feels deliberate. Every turn reveals a new angle of the fortress, a new facet of its silent intelligence. When you finally emerge onto the keep's first landing, you stop and let your eyes adjust. The great hall inside feels cavernous, yet strangely intimate. You can sense the thought behind every arch, every corner. This was the king or lord's refuge, the symbolic heart of the castle. The keep was designed not just to survive sieges, but to project power. Standing here, you feel both tiny and important, an intended effect, a psychological tool crafted in stone. Historians still argue whether keeps were primarily military strongholds or psychological instruments meant to awe visitors. Likely, they were both. The walls are thick, sometimes up to 20 feet in places, and yet their proportions feel oddly graceful, like a body armored for battle but trained in etiquette. You run your hands along the cold stone of the interior. Every groove. The keep is a living museum of practical luxury and strategic genius. Narrow slit windows let light spill across the floor in elegant patterns, yet they were also deadly for attackers. Anyone trying to breach this height would face arrows raining down from all angles. As you walk across the floor, you notice signs of everyday life that make you almost smile. Fire pits built into the walls provided warmth without smoke filling the room. Iron hooks and wooden beams mark where tapestries once hung, insulating against cold winters and signaling status. Even the placement of staircases seems intentional, controlling how visitors moved through the space and ensuring that the Lord's presence dominated every encounter. The keep wasn't only functionally, was theatrical. You imagine nobles arriving for audience, their eyes drawn upward to the vaulted ceilings, the banners fluttering, the carved stone reminding them of the Lord's reach and wealth. It was a form of subtle intimidation. One glance, and you knew your place. One quirky tidbit. In some keeps, builders embedded small, carved faces called grotesques into the stonework, not for drainage like gargoyles, but for humor, mischief, or even superstition. You can imagine a tired lord looking at these faces and chuckling quietly, knowing only he and the masons appreciated the joke. Climbing higher, you reach the Lord's private chambers. The spiral staircase tightens, and the walls narrow, creating a sense of anticipation. This is where strategy, politics, and intrigue intersected with daily life. You can almost feel the whispers of advisors, the clatter of quills on parchment, the occasional gasp of scandal. Historians still debate whether the layout of these chambers was driven more by security or by social convention. Certainly, the rooms were designed to be defensible, but they were also a statement of prestige, a spatial performance of authority. Every doorway, every window, every beam sent a subtle message. The Lord is powerful, untouchable, and omniscient. You pause at a window slit, peering out over the battlements. The view is breathtaking: rolling hills, distant forests, the castle's outer walls snaking like protective veins around the courtyard below. From this height, it's easy to forget the danger that exists just beyond the gates, but the architecture keeps it at the forefront. This is what makes the keep so psychologically effective. You're reminded of the duality, awe and fear, beauty and brutality, comfort and constant alertness. And then you notice the hidden corners. A small door, cleverly concealed behind a tapestry, leads to an escape staircase winding downward. Priestly hides, secret stairways, and concealed storage rooms all hint at the Lord's paranoia and foresight. Every inch of the keep balances opulence with protection, luxury with defense. You step back into the open space of the main chamber and run your fingers along the cold stone floor again. The acoustics are strange. Your footsteps echo, but the room is alive with subtle resonance. Imagine shouting here in a panic, the sound bouncing and amplifying, reaching defenders positioned strategically on upper levels. Every design choice has a purpose, whether you see it or not. One more quirky fact: some keeps were deliberately made confusing on the interior, with offset doors, misleading corridors, and trap rooms meant to disorient intruders. Imagine wandering in circles, heart racing, while defenders above sigh politely and pour hot water from the murder holes. Ingenious. As you descend a secondary stair to a balcony overlooking the courtyard, you notice the psychological layer once again. Visitors feel exposed yet honored, small yet observed. The keep is a masterclass in spatial authority, a vertical assertion of dominance. You feel the centuries pressing around you, the weight of power, and the quiet thrill of walking through what was once the very center of a Lord's universe. Even centuries later, standing here, you understand why keeps were feared, admired, and meticulously defended. They were more than stone. They were statements, strategies, and subtle performances, all wrapped into one towering, formidable package. And as the wind brushes past your face atop the battlements, you can't help but feel the careful balance of control, danger, and genius that shaped every stone beneath your feet. The keep is both a sanctuary and a challenge, an eternal reminder that architecture can speak louder than words. You take a slow breath and look around, realizing that every inch of this fortress seems to think for itself. The castle isn't just a structure, it's a mind, a strategic organism. Every wall, every window, every stone step is part of a defense system so layered and deliberate, it feels almost sentient. You descend back toward the courtyard, tracing the castle's defensive anatomy as you go. At first glance, it all looks like a maze of walls and gates, but soon you see the pattern, the choreography of medieval defense. This wasn't chaos. It was a symphony written in limestone and mortar. Let's start at the outer wall, called the curtain wall. It's tall, sloped, and punctuated by towers that protrude outward like watchful eyes. Each tower has arrow slits angled to cover every blind spot, ensuring that not a single corner of the wall could be approached unseen. Attackers would face crossfire from above, and both sides, simultaneously, deadly geometry. Just beyond that wall, you notice a ditch or trench, not always filled with water moats, often were dry but designed to slow movement, break ladders, and expose soldiers to arrow fire. If the moat was wet, even better, heavy armor became a drowning hazard. Crossing that moat, an attacker would face the gatehouse, the most deceptive feature of all. It looks like a grand entrance, but it's really a trap disguised as hospitality. Once inside, you'd find yourself in a narrow stone corridor called the killing zone. From above, defenders could unleash pure chaos, arrows, stones, boiling water, hot sand, even tar. Yes, sand. Boiling water was expensive and risky to handle, but hot sand, fine, blistering, and unstoppable, slipped beneath armor plates and seared flesh. Ingenious and horrifying. You look up at the murder holes in the ceiling, perfectly placed gaps for raining down punishment on anyone unfortunate enough to get that far. And if the portcullis, the iron gate, was slammed down behind them, they were trapped like fish in a net. Then came the drawbridge, a deceptively simple machine. Counterweighted and reinforced with oak, it could be raised within seconds. It wasn't just a bridge, it was a door, a shield, and sometimes even a weapon. The sound of chains grinding, the heavy thud of the bridge closing it, must have echoed like thunder during an attack. As you move inward, you pass through another gate and another. Medieval architects loved layers. A castle's defense wasn't meant to stop enemies at one point. It was designed to bleed them slowly, to exhaust confuse, and terrify. Each courtyard narrowed, forcing attackers to bunch together, while defenders above could rain down arrows and insults in equal measure. And then there were the walls within walls. Each layer bought the defenders more time. Each gate another chance to regroup. It wasn't uncommon for attackers to spend days or even weeks breaching just the outer defenses only, to realize the real battle hadn't even begun yet. Inside the second ward, you see the bailey, the open courtyard surrounded by stables, smithies, and storerooms. It might have seemed like the safe zone, but it too was part of the psychological design. If attackers breached the outer wall, they'd feel victorious till arrows began falling from the keep above, from angles impossible to defend against. You glance up again at the matriculation stone balconies jutting from the walls with openings in the floor. They were used for dropping rocks or liquids directly onto enemies, hugging the base of the wall. From below, it must have felt like the sky itself was against you. But perhaps the most brilliant part of castle defense was in the stone at all. It was in the illusion of vulnerability. Some gates were built deliberately, weaker looking, to lure attackers into a false sense of progress, guiding them straight into death traps. Fake doors, dead-end corridors, and narrow staircases designed so right-handed swordsmen would be at a disadvantage. All subtle manipulations of space and psychology. Standing there, you realize that the castle was less a fortress and more a machine of fear. Every sound, chains rattling, doors slamming, torches crackling would have amplified that dread. Defenders knew it and used it. Even the spiral staircases were built with intent. Most turned clockwise as you ascended, favoring right-handed defenders, striking downward and hampering right-handed attackers climbing up. That tiny twist of design could decide the outcome of hand-to-hand combat. You imagine the scene, a siege raging outside, banners torn by the wind, arrows whistling, and the air thick with smoke. Inside, defenders move like clockwork archers at the walls, knights waiting by the inner gate, servants hauling stones and boiling oil to the upper levels. The entire castle becomes alive, breathing, groaning, and enduring. It's eerie to think that in many cases, sieges weren't won by battle, but by patience. A castle might hold out for months, even years, while the attackers starved outside. Eventually, disease or exhaustion would decide the victor. Sometimes, castles weren't conquered, they simply surrendered to silence. And yet, through it all, there's beauty. The craftsmanship, the thought, the almost artistic control of chaos. The medieval builder didn't have blueprints in the modern sense. They had instinct, geometry, and imagination. Every wall they raised, every arrow slit they carved, was an act of defiance against nature and time. Now, as you walk along the ramparts one last time, the view stretches endlessly. Hills, fields, distant villages that once relied on this place for safety. You can almost hear the faint hum of history beneath your feet, the heartbeat of the castle itself. Its anatomy is ancient, but its logic is timeless. Protect, control, endure. And as the wind rushes through the battlements, whispering through arrow slits and broken towers, it feels almost as if the castle is breathing still, reminding you that in the end, even stone can think. From the ramparts, you can see the sun breaking through the clouds, casting golden streaks over the castle's outer walls. You pause, letting the wind play with your hair, and realize just how much of the fortress is designed to manipulate perspective. Every wall, every tower, every slit window has been placed not only for defense, but to project a sense of invincibility. You probably wouldn't survive, imagining the countless invaders who approached and never made it past the first layer. You walk toward one of the corner towers, the stone steps winding tightly beneath your boots. The walls here are thicker, almost suffocating in their density. This is where the castle's genius truly begins to reveal itself. The tower keeps. It's not just a lookout, it's a hub of layered defense. From here, archers could cover overlapping fields, while the floors themselves were compartmentalized to delay intruders. Every spiral stair, every trapdoor, every murder hole above is a node in a network designed to crush momentum and disorient attackers. Historians still argue whether the spiral staircases were intentionally clockwise to favor right-handed defenders, or if it was simply a convention that stuck. Either way, the effect is undeniable. A soldier ascending with sword drawn is awkwardly twisted, struggling for leverage, while the defender above moves fluidly. You can't help but smirk, imagining the first left-handed soldier cursing the ingenuity of medieval architects. Inside the tower, the air smells faintly of smoke and centuries-old dust. You trace your fingers along the rough stone, noticing small niches built into the walls. Some held lamps, others weapons, and a few were simply for observation. These tiny architectural flourishes are like the castle's nervous system, allowing it to sense, respond, and punish any intrusion. You peek through one of the narrow arrow slits. Outside, the courtyard looks peaceful now, but you know what it once meant, a gauntlet of chaos. Archers would stand hidden in these slits, firing with near impunity at anyone unfortunate enough to be caught below. The angles are deceptive. From the outside, it seems impossible to shoot. Yet, inside, you realize the field of fire is carefully calculated. And then there are the machicolations, those stone projections that jut out like overhanging teeth. Looking down, you can imagine boiling water, sand, or rocks cascading over attackers. A single defender could wreak havoc on multiple invaders with minimal effort. You probably wouldn't survive standing below, but from here, it's mesmerizing, like watching a choreographed storm of medieval ingenuity. You move to the tower's upper level, where the walls are thinner, the view nearly panoramic. The courtyard, the outer bailey, the distant hills all fall into your gaze. You notice faint marks on the stone, small carvings that look almost like doodles. Medieval soldiers and residents left these as signs of their presence, little hints of life in a place designed to discourage life. One quirky fact: some carvings were game boards etched into the stone, likely for passing time during long sieges. Can you imagine playing tic-tac-toe while boiling oil drips above? Historians still argue how much leisure actually occurred during sieges versus how much was imagined in the accounts of chroniclers. But the existence of these carvings suggests that human life persisted even in the most militarized spaces. You feel a strange connection to those people, their hands brushing the same stone centuries ago. Looking out through another slit, you notice how the castle's geometry manipulates perception. Distances appear longer, angles sharper. A soldier outside might think the walls stretch on endlessly, And that's precisely the effect the builders wanted. It's psychological warfare, trapping fear in your mind before it even reaches your body. The staircase spirals upward again, narrowing until you reach the rooftop battlement. Here, the view is breathtaking. Rolling hills, winding rivers, and forests that seem to stretch forever. You imagine the sentries stationed here, scanning for miles around, knowing every bend in the river, every tree line hiding potential threats. The castle is not just a defensive structure, it's a control tower over the surrounding land, and above it all, the lookout room, a small, enclosed space with narrow windows, was the crown jewel of observation. A single person could monitor the horizon, signal other towers or light beacons to communicate impending danger. It's an early warning system, elegant in its simplicity and terrifyingly effective in practice. You take a slow breath, letting the wind whip across your face. You realize that every feature, from arrow slit to matriculation, was part of a living strategy, a mechanical mind spread across stone and timber. This castle didn't just sit there, it reacted, it anticipated, it punished mistakes and rewarded caution. Historians still argue whether castles were primarily military fortifications or status symbols, designed to impress and intimidate. But standing here, you can feel the overlap. It's art and science, terror and beauty, all wrapped into one massive vertical masterpiece. And as the sun dips lower, spilling golden light across the battlements, you can't help but marvel at the careful, terrifying genius of the medieval mind, one that saw stone not just as material, but as a weapon, a message, and a safeguard all at once. Descending from the rooftop, you feel a faint tremor underfoot, as if the castle itself is settling into the earth, groaning under the weight of centuries. You wander along the inner walls, brushing your fingers against the cold stone, imagining the hands that carved them, lifted them, and assembled them into something that could withstand both siege and time. This is where the genius of castle engineering really shows. Every angle, every stone, every layer had a purpose. You pause at the base of a rounded tower. Its curves aren't aesthetic. They deflect incoming projectiles. Stones hurled by trebuchets glance harmlessly off, rather than shattering the wall. A flat wall might have crumbled, but curved walls are like ancient physics in practice. Historians still argue whether the exact curvature was mathematically calculated or arrived at through trial, error, and sheer stubbornness. Either way, the result is undeniable: resilience. You notice the moat running around the outer perimeter. Today, it's shallow and quiet, almost ornamental. But imagine it filled with water, mud, or even spikes hidden beneath the surface. Attackers attempting to cross would be slowed, funneled, and exhausted before they even touched the first gate. One quirky tidbit: in some castles, the moat water was stocked with fish, serving both as food during long sieges and as an unexpected swimming lesson for anyone foolish enough to fall in. You probably wouldn't survive. Crossing to the main gate, you see the portcullis groove, deep and polished from centuries of use. The iron grate would drop with terrifying speed if needed, blocking entry and crushing momentum. But there's more. Hidden recesses along the sides were sometimes filled with spikes, hooks, or boiling water conduits. The design is brutally efficient. Inside the courtyard, your eyes catch arrow loops at varying heights. They aren't random. Some are 4-foot soldiers, some for mounted defenders, some to allow crossfire. From outside, it looks chaotic, but the internal logic is flawless. Every slanted slit is a calculated killing field, turning the castle into a deadly orchestra of angles. You wander past stables, smithies, and storage rooms. Even the seemingly mundane parts of a castle are designed with defense in mind. Kitchens, for example, were often elevated or separated from the main living quarters, so fires couldn't easily spread. Historians still argue how much of this was practical versus precautionary paranoia. But the fact that it persisted across centuries suggests a keen awareness of risk. You glance up at the towers again. Each matriculation seems to leer at you, projecting power while harboring a threat above. You probably wouldn't survive standing under one during a siege. But from here, it's awe-inspiring. A perfect marriage of offense and defense, visibility and concealment. Even the spacing between towers is deliberate, allowing overlapping fields of fire. Every design choice amplifies the castle's lethality. A narrow staircase beckons you upward. The steps are worn unevenly, evidence of centuries of foot traffic. You remember the spirals favoring right-handed defenders and realize this design extends to nearly every staircase within the fortress. The castle is subtly shaping movement, control, and confrontation at every turn. You reach the top of a secondary tower, slightly lower than the main keep. From here, you can see the surrounding village, farmlands, and a river that snakes like a silver ribbon. The castle doesn't just defend itself. It dominates the landscape, communicating authority, wealth, and deterrence to anyone approaching. Quirky fact: some towers had false doors or hidden ledges that served as decoys, confusing attackers or giving defenders a tactical edge. It's like playing a three-dimensional chess game where each move could be deadly. The wind gusts, whipping through the battlements and carrying the faint scent of wet stone. You close your eyes and try to imagine the chaos of a medieval Sajaros, whistling, catapults crashing, men shouting. Every feature of the castle you've touched and seen becomes clearer in purpose, an interconnected web of protection and intimidation. Even the placement of gates, towers, and walls shows a kind of calculated choreography. Historians still debate whether castles were primarily reactive to evolving siege technologies, or whether architects anticipated those changes decades in advance. Standing here, it feels like both, a constant negotiation between threat and ingenuity. You descend one last time into the courtyard, letting your hands graze the moss-covered walls. The air is thick, slightly damp, filled with the echoes of centuries. Every corner, every slit, every hidden chamber whispers a story of fear, foresight, strategy, and the endless human determination to endure. And as you pause, taking it all in, the castle doesn't just feel like a fortress, it feels like a living memory, an architectural mind frozen in stone, endlessly watching, endlessly waiting. You climb the final stretch to the top of the main keep, where the wind bites more sharply, whipping around the battlements and carrying the scent of distant pine and damp earth. From here, the castle is revealed in its full glory, walls spiraling outward, towers jutting skyward, moats and ditches snaking below like protective veins. You realize that medieval architects weren't just building fortresses. They were constructing monuments to strategy, each stone placed with precision, foresight, and occasionally a dash of theatrical flair. The rooftop is cold under your boots, rough with centuries-old wear, and you lean on the parapet to study the courtyard far below. Tiny human figures, likely imagined, trudge across the yard, unaware that even the smallest movement would have been calculated centuries ago. Every arch, every window, every arrow slit was positioned to maximize visibility and fire coverage, leaving almost no place for an enemy to hide. You probably wouldn't survive long if you were caught under the crossfire of archers stationed here. Historians still argue whether these defensive features were the result of standardized military principles or the creative improvisation of local masons. Either way, the effect is undeniable. A single tower can dominate the surrounding landscape, creating overlapping zones of control that extend beyond the castle itself. You notice the hoarding's temporary wooden platforms jutting from the walls, supported by brackets and scaffolds. They could be quickly added during a siege to allow defenders to attack directly downward while remaining protected. The wood would creak underfoot, but it added a layer of vertical depth to the castle's defense. Some even had small trapdoors for dropping stones or boiling oil, a terrifying tool of siege warfare. One quirky fact: defenders sometimes lined these platforms with animal hides to prevent arrows from bouncing and hitting them, a medieval solution that was surprisingly effective. Looking across the battlements, you spot the curtain walls connecting adjacent towers. They aren't straight, but slightly angled and staggered. This isn't random. It forces attackers into predictable paths, slowing their progress while exposing them to continuous defensive fire. The castle's architecture manipulates both movement and perception, turning geography into a weapon. Inside the keep, narrow staircases twist unpredictably. You remember how the clockwise spiral stairs favored right-handed defenders above, giving them leverage in combat, while attackers struggled with restricted swings and awkward positioning. Some towers even had hidden recesses and false doors, designed to confuse intruders or allow defenders to stage ambushes. You can almost hear the muffled shouts, the clash of swords, and the echoing fear as invaders realized they'd been led straight into a trap. Historians still debate how much of this deceptive design was standard versus experimental. Some castles appear chaotic, with staircases, doorways, and chambers that seem illogical. Others are precise and symmetrical, suggesting a mix of necessity and ingenuity. Either way, the effect is psychological as well as tactical. An attacker might be defeated by confusion and exhaustion before the first arrow even flies. As you step along the crenellated edges, the merlins, those upright stones along the parapet, cast long, jagged shadows. You imagine archers standing behind them, shafts ready, eyes narrowed, hearts steady. Between the gaps, the open crenels allowed for offensive action, but the merlins provided vital cover. It's a perfect balance of risk and protection, a rhythm of attack and defense codified in stone. You glance at the machicolations, the overhanging stone projections with openings in their floors. You shiver slightly, imagining the torrents of rocks, boiling water, and sand that could fall on attackers below. The engineers of these castles thought not only in terms of walls, but in 3 dimensions: above, below, inside, and outside. Every angle was weaponized. Moving toward the north-facing tower, you notice tiny carved grooves along the stone walls. These were likely designed to hold scaffolding or rope ladders, making repairs easier without compromising defense. Some masons even embedded small stones with initials or symbols as a personal signature. Subtle touches of human life in a fortress of calculated death. Quirky, yes, but these inscriptions also remind you that castles were built by people who thought, joked, and maybe even cursed silently as they lifted tons of stone into place. You step back and take in the panorama, the outer walls, the courtyard, the winding roads leading into the valley. Everything is interconnected, moat to gatehouse, tower to keep, wall to tower, all functioning as an elaborate system. The castle isn't just a structure, it's a machine of defense, a living map of human ingenuity, paranoia, and necessity. And as the sun dips toward the horizon, you feel the quiet hum of centuries pressing against the stone. A reminder that these fortresses weren't just built to survive attacks, they were built to survive time itself. You descend from the rooftop, letting your hands brush along the cold, rough stone of the battlements. The castle feels alive beneath your touch, each groove, each crevice, whispering secrets of sieges, celebrations, and whispered intrigues. You pause for a moment in the courtyard, noticing the uneven flagstones worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic. It's here, in the spaces between towers and keeps, that the genius of castle design extends beyond defense into the subtleties of daily life. Courtyards weren't just open spaces, they were controlled environments. Attackers who breached the outer walls would find themselves funneled here, exposed to defensive fire from all sides, while inhabitants could move about with relative safety. You probably wouldn't survive a long siege standing in one of these open areas without some creative luck or sheer agility. Yet, for the castle's residents, this same courtyard served as a communal space, stables, kitchens, workshops, and sometimes even gardens. Life persisted amid the looming threat of violence. Historians still argue whether the open courtyards were primarily practical or psychological tools designed to impress visitors as much as to trap enemies. Either way, the effect is undeniable. The space conveys a sense of scale, control, and authority that is hard to ignore. You can feel it underfoot, the subtle pull of history shaping your steps. You wander past the armory, where racks of pikes, swords, and crossbows would have lined the walls. Imagine the clang of iron as soldiers prepared for an incoming siege, their breaths fogging the air, the scent of oil and smoke mingling with dust. One quirky fact: in some castles, weapons were intentionally displayed in aesthetically pleasing patterns, almost like medieval art installations, blending functionality with intimidation. You probably wouldn't survive standing there when a crossbow bolt whistles past, but you can't help smiling at the bizarre elegance of it. Next, you approach the kitchens, often massive, bustling areas designed to feed hundreds during sieges. Large hearths, boiling cauldrons, and stacks of wood dominate the space. Some castles even had cleverly designed dumbwaiters and pulley systems to transport hot food to higher floors, without leaving the cooks exposed to danger. Historians still debate how much of this ingenuity was standardized across Europe or specific to certain regions. but the logistical genius is clear. As you wander further, you notice secret passages and hidden chambers tucked behind false walls. They're subtle, almost invisible, unless you know where to look. Some were escape routes. Others were storage rooms or hidden observation points. Quirky fact. A few castles even included hidden prison rooms disguised as closets or pantries, where a prisoner could be left without being noticed for days. The lines between daily life and defense are blurred in these spaces. You step into a watchtower overlooking the outer walls, peering through arrow slits. From this vantage point, you see how multiple layers of defense overlap: the moat, the curtain wall, the gatehouse, and the inner walls all interact like a choreographed performance. An attacker would be funneled, trapped, and disoriented before ever reaching the inner keep. You probably wouldn't survive attempting to navigate this gauntlet. Yet standing here, it's almost hypnotic to see the precision of design. Inside the inner walls, residential quarters reveal a mix of comfort and practicality. Rooms were often small but warm, with fireplaces, tapestries for insulation, and even private chapels. You imagine lords and ladies moving about, organizing the daily routine, hosting visitors, and managing the castle's complex operations, all while living under constant threat. Historians still argue whether castles were primarily military or domestic spaces, but clearly both functions were carefully interwoven. You wander past stairs leading to battlements, noticing the wear patterns in the stone. They twist and turn unpredictably, ensuring that attackers would lose rhythm and momentum. It's another subtle way the architecture shapes human movement, prioritizing defense at every step. Quirky fact: some stairs even widened or narrowed mid-flight to manipulate the flow of people, making it easier to defend or escape depending on the situation. Looking across the courtyard once more, you realize the genius isn't just in the stone walls or the towers in the entire spatial orchestration. Every path, every slope, every window is part of a grand strategy. The castle is a machine, a labyrinth, and a home, simultaneously embodying centuries of tactical thinking, architectural skill, and human adaptability. As the light fades and shadows stretch long across the courtyard, you can almost hear the echoes of the past, the footfalls of soldiers, the laughter of children, the hushed conversations of lords plotting strategy. Every corner of the castle seems to hum with the weight of its own history, reminding you that these fortresses were more than stone. They were living, breathing embodiments of medieval genius. You leave the courtyard behind, moving deeper into the castle's inner sanctum, where the walls feel heavier and the air is cooler, almost damp with centuries of trapped moisture. The keep looms above you like a silent sentinel, each floor a new layer of strategy and subtle dominance. Here, you begin to understand that a castle isn't just a defensive structure, it's a psychological instrument engineered to impress, intimidate, and control. Walking along narrow hallways, you notice the thickness of the walls, sometimes 6 or more feet, designed not only to withstand siege engines, but to muffler sound. Conversations, whispers, and footsteps all carry differently inside. The lord and his family could move about privately, while attackers outside were disoriented by echoes and confusing acoustics. You probably wouldn't survive trying to shout coherently through these corridors during a siege. Yet the effect on perception is clear. Historians still argue whether the interior design of castles prioritized comfort or military advantage, and the evidence suggests a balance. For example, spiral staircases weren't only defensive, they also guided movement with a certain social logic, dictating who could access certain areas and in what order. Visitors, servants, and soldiers moved along prescribed paths without even realizing it, subtly reinforcing the Lord's authority. You pause at a private chamber where a fireplace flickers dimly, casting warm light on cold stone. These rooms were surprisingly comfortable, often lined with tapestries to insulate against winter drafts. Some chambers even included small latrines built into the walls, ingenious, but slightly inconvenient for anyone caught in a midnight rush. Quirky fact: in some castles, latrines were designed to discharge into the moat, ensuring a constant flow of deterrence for would-be intruders. You probably wouldn't survive leaning over the edge casually, but it's a reminder that practicality and strategy often intersected in weird ways. Moving toward the Great Hall, you feel the weight of history settle on your shoulders. This was the heart of social life, where meals were shared, disputes settled, and proclamations made. The hall's high vaulted ceilings weren't just for grandeur, they also helped control acoustics, allowing a single voice to carry across dozens of meters. Imagine a lord addressing his court, every word amplified, every glance commanding attention. Historians still debate whether such spaces were more about power projection or ceremony. But standing here, it's easy to see how both functions overlap. You step onto a balcony overlooking the courtyard. From here, the castle's defensive geometry becomes even more apparent. Multiple layers of walls, staggered towers, and narrow alleys converge in a carefully orchestrated pattern designed to maximize exposure of attackers while minimizing risk to defenders. It's less a fortress and more a three-dimensional puzzle, with each element interacting seamlessly with the others. Inside, smaller corridors branch off, leading to storage rooms and secret chambers. These spaces were multifunctional, storing food and weapons, hiding valuable, or providing emergency escape routes. Quirky fact: some chambers were intentionally disorienting, with crooked doors and offset walls designed to confuse intruders or even make them feel lost in the maze. You probably wouldn't survive wandering in one of these without a guide, but it's a brilliant psychological defense. As you walk past the chapel, you notice the subtle interplay of light and shadow. Narrow windows allow slivers of sunlight to illuminate the altar at specific times, a mix of practical design and symbolic intent. Faith and defense intertwined here. Morale and divine approval were considered as important as stone and steel. Historians still argue about the symbolic versus functional role of these religious spaces, but the influence is undeniable. You notice the armories tucked into corners near staircases and entrances. Weapons were carefully organized, ready for rapid deployment. Crossbows, pikes, swords, and even early firearms. Yes, you probably wouldn't survive if someone fired one in this close spacework positioned to maximize efficiency. The placement isn't random. It's a tactical map embedded into the very architecture of the castle. Wandering into the upper chambers, you sense the psychological layering. Narrow hallways, offset doors, and concealed openings all serve to confuse and control movement. Visitors were guided, consciously or unconsciously, through spaces that reinforced the Lord's authority. Every room, every window, every angle was a tool, a message. This is my domain, and you move here only as I permit. Even mundane features like hearths, benches, and storage niches reveal subtle genius. Fireplaces warm, but also control airflow and smoke. Benches organize movement, while storage niches hide essentials or act as secret compartments. Quirky fact: some niches were specifically designed to hold documents in dry, protected areas. Early attempts at organizational efficiency under siege conditions. You probably wouldn't survive trying to extract one during a raid, but it's clever nonetheless. The keep is more than walls and stone. It's an interplay of psychology, social hierarchy, and military genius, all folded into one vertical monument. As you step back and glance along the corridors, you feel the calculated rhythm, movement, visibility, and authority choreographed through centuries of architectural intuition. You pause at a window slit, peering out at the outer walls, the moat, and the winding road beyond. The castle's genius isn't just in what you seats in, what you don't. The hidden staircases, the trap doors, the subtle angles designed to manipulate perception and movement. Standing here, you sense the hum of centuries of thought embedded into every stone, reminding you that medieval architects weren't just builders, they were strategists, psychologists, and artists all at once. You descend from the keep's upper chambers, stepping carefully along the worn flagstones, the echoes of your footsteps mingling with imagined whispers from centuries past. The castle seems almost to breathe around you, each wall and tower exhaling stories of triumph, terror, and daily life under stone and timber. You start to notice how logistics and defense intertwine, the subtle genius of a design that kept people alive, provisions intact, and invaders at bay. Turning a corner, you see the well nestled in the inner courtyard. This wasn't just any well. It was often a deep, fortified lifeline, sometimes reaching dozens of meters below ground to secure a reliable water supply during extended sieges. Without it, the castle could not sustain its residents for more than a few days, regardless of walls or towers. One quirky fact: some wells were lined with lead to prevent contamination, and rumors of hidden treasure chambers sometimes circulated around these mysterious vertical tunnels. You probably wouldn't survive dropping your bucket carelessly into one of these shafts. Historians still argue whether the precise placement of wells was dictated by topography, superstition, or pure strategic calculation, but the impact on survival is unquestionable. Water is life, and in a siege, it is leverage, patience, and sometimes the deciding factor. Nearby, the granaries and storerooms are stacked with barrels, sacks of grain, and preserved foods. Castles were not merely defensive constructs, they were self-contained ecosystems designed to sustain hundreds over months or even years. You walk past racks of dried meats and cheeses, imagining the smell mingling with wood smoke and stone dust. Quirky tidbit: some granaries incorporated pest-repelling features like raised floors or special lining, demonstrating a surprisingly advanced understanding of hygiene and preservation. You probably wouldn't survive the taste testing, if left unguarded, but it's a testament to careful planning. Moving to the armory, the sheer volume of weapons is overwhelming. Crossbows, swords, pikes, even early hand cannons line the walls and racks. It's not just storage, it's a strategic map. Every weapon positioned for rapid access, depending on where attackers might breach. Archers could grab bolts in one movement. Infantry swordsmen could reach pikes before the enemy even closed the distance. Historians still argue how standardized this placement was across different regions. But standing here, the logic is undeniable. Efficiency could mean survival. As you wander toward the gatehouse, you notice the layering of defenses, drawbridges, portcullises, and murder holes all overlap in a deadly symphony. The portcullis, a heavy iron grid, could trap intruders in the killing zone, where defenders above rained stones, boiling water, or sand. Quirky fact: some castles had grooves cut along the portcullis to hold oil-soaked chains, which could be ignited during desperate sieges, creating a brief but terrifying firestorm. You probably wouldn't survive standing below. You explore the staircases connecting different wards. The clockwise spiral design still influences your footing, naturally favoring a defender's right-handed swing while forcing attackers into awkward movements. Some staircases are narrow enough that only one person can ascend at a time, slowing momentum and making even a small garrison highly effective against large forces. Historians still debate whether such designs were widely intentional or developed regionally, but you can feel the logic in every turn. You pause near archer slits and machicolations, looking down at the courtyard far below. The angles are brilliant. Defenders could hit anyone approaching from multiple directions, yet remain mostly protected themselves. It's physics and psychology in stone. Quirky tidbit: some slits were slightly curved to give a subtle panoramic effect, allowing archers to track movement with minimal body exposure. You probably wouldn't survive standing there, but it's a beautiful fusion of design and utility. As evening light spills over the castle, the moat glimmers faintly, and the towers cast long protective shadows over the walls. Even from this distance, the fortress communicates its message: power, control, and resilience. It's easy to imagine the psychological effect on attackers seeing this immense structure rise above the land, fully prepared, layered with defenses, and capable of watching every approach. Every element, from the well to the gatehouse, from armory to staircases, interconnected. The castle operates like a living organism, each part supporting the whole, each innovation reinforcing the other. It's a balance of offense, defense, sustenance, and psychology, all sculpted into stone and timber. And as you pause once more, imagining the bustle of defenders, cooks, and guards in preparation for an attack, you sense that this ingenuity, simultaneously practical, strategic, and almost artistic, is what allowed castles to dominate the medieval landscape for centuries. They were more than fortresses. They were engineered survival stories. You step into the quiet corridors of the inner keep, the air cooler here, carrying faint scents of smoke, stone, and centuries-old dust. The castle feels simultaneously alive and frozen in time, a place where strategy and daily life coexist in a delicate equilibrium. Every stone seems intentional, every archway a decision with both tactical and practical consequences. You trudge carefully, your footsteps echoing, as you realize that medieval castles weren't just static fortresses. They were complex machines of survival and control. Walking past a storeroom, you notice barrels stacked with grains, dried meats, and even hidden caches of salt. Castles were essentially self-contained ecosystems, meant to sustain their inhabitants for months, sometimes years. Quirky fact: some storage rooms were designed with angled floors or holes in the walls to allow rodents to fall into traps rather than infest provisions. You probably wouldn't survive accidentally knocking over one of these cleverly designed bins, but it's a reminder of medieval ingenuity in everyday life. Historians still argue whether this kind of logistical planning was widespread or limited to wealthier castles. But there's no denying that food storage and distribution were critical. Every element of the castle's interior reinforced its defensive purpose, even in mundane spaces. You move into the great hall, where high ceilings and tall windows dominate the room. Sunlight slants through narrow openings, casting intricate shadows across the stone floor. The acoustics amplify a single voice, ensuring that a lord's commands carried clearly across dozens of meters. Imagine standing here during a feast or council, every whisper and step contributing to the atmosphere of authority and order. Quirky tidbit: some great halls had hidden doors or panels that allowed servants to appear suddenly, almost like stage magic, serving food or observing conversations without being noticed. You probably wouldn't survive being caught unaware by such a sudden entrance, but it's a playful touch amid the serious architecture. Further along, you encounter chapels tucked into corners, small but carefully constructed, light filters through stained glass, illuminating altars and pews. These religious spaces were functional and symbolic, reinforcing morale and divine authority. Historians still debate how central faith was in the actual day-to-day defense strategy versus ceremonial presence, but its influence permeated both physical and social structures. You wander to the armory, a room brimming with weapons, meticulously arranged for immediate access. Swords, crossbows, pikes, and shields line the walls, ready to be mobilized. Even the placement seems like a tactical map. You notice that weapons are positioned near likely points of attack. Quirky fact: some armories included small traps or secret compartments to protect high-value weapons from theft or misuse. You probably wouldn't survive attempting to grab a crossbow mid-siege without understanding this careful system. Moving to a narrow spiral staircase, you feel the design favoring defenders. Right-handed swings have room, while attackers struggle in the confined space. Some staircases widen and narrow unpredictably, subtly manipulating movement. Historians still debate whether this was universal or varied regionally. But standing here, you sense the practicality and cleverness firsthand. From the top of another tower, you peer through machicolations at the courtyard below. Imagine defenders dropping stones, boiling water, or sand onto attackers trapped between overlapping walls. The angles and geometry are perfected to maximize exposure while minimizing risk to those inside. Quirky tidbit: some machicolations had small niches or overhangs to give defenders temporary concealment, like medieval camo. You probably wouldn't survive standing underneath in the wrong place. But the combination of psychology and engineering is mesmerizing. The gatehouse is a marvel in its own right. Drawbridges, portcullises, and multiple doors create layered zones of defense. Attackers are funneled through predictable paths, while defenders maintain the high ground. Some castles even included false gates or decoy entrances designed to confuse invaders. You probably wouldn't survive trying to navigate one of these without a guide. But from here, it's a brilliant integration of architecture and strategy. As the light fades toward dusk, you walk along the inner curtain walls, noticing arrow slits and overlapping fields of fire. The castle is like a living diagram of defensive geometry, each angle calculated to manipulate perception, movement, and vulnerability. Historians still argue how standardized these designs were. But standing here, it's clear that survival demanded a meticulous understanding of space, human behavior, and mechanical advantage. You pause to trace your fingers along a carved niche. Little decorative touches, animal carving, initial, or tiny geometric symbols remind you that humans lived here, worked here, and played here, even as the stones themselves scream strategy. Quirky fact: some carvings were game boards for soldiers waiting out sieges. You probably wouldn't survive trying to sneak a game unnoticed during a tense attack. But it's a small, humanizing detail amid the military genius. As shadows stretch across walls and towers, you realize that every stone, every corner, every design choice reinforces the castle's dual nature: protective and intimidating, functional and psychological. Even after centuries, the fortress communicates control, order, and strategy, a frozen choreography of survival, power, and human ingenuity. You step out from the keep's shadow into the open air of the castle-esque outer walls, feeling the cold wind curl around your face, carrying the scent of wet stone and distant forests. The castle stretches outward in a web of towers, battlements, and moats, a perfect demonstration of defensive orchestration. Every corner, every parapet, every slit in the walls has been carefully calculated to manipulate attackers and protect residents. Standing here, it's easy to feel dwarfed by centuries of ingenuity and the quiet, relentless logic of medieval architects. Your gaze follows the outer curtain walls, thick and slightly angled, designed to deflect projectiles and confuse enemy movements. You probably wouldn't survive testing their strength firsthand. Yet you can appreciate the subtle elegance of the angles and the way they interlock with towers. Some walls feature deliberately irregular placements, confusing attackers and preventing scaling ladders from finding a stable foothold. Historians still argue whether such irregularities were accidental, born of local topography, or intentionally deceptive. But the effect is undeniably strategic. Along the walls, you notice the gatehouse, the most visible symbol of both authority and vulnerability. The main entrance combines drawbridge, portcullis, and multiple doors, creating layers of control. Attackers would be funneled into a narrow killing zone, while defenders above rained down arrows, stones, or boiling water. Quirky fact: some castles had trap mechanisms under the drawbridge that could collapse boards or release hidden spikes if attackers tried to cross too quickly. You probably wouldn't survive testing one of these devices. But it's an astonishing example of human ingenuity under pressure. You wander toward a secondary tower, slightly lower than the main keep, but still strategically essential. Its machicolations and arrow slits are angled to cover overlapping zones with the primary tower, creating a crossfire grid that's almost invisible from a distance. Every feature here is a three-dimensional trap, exploiting gravity, line of sight, and human predictability. Historians still debate the exact reasoning behind some placements, but the results leave little doubt. Attackers were at a constant disadvantage. The moat glistens faintly in the dying light, a final barrier between the outside world and the fortress. Originally filled with water, sometimes spiked or reinforced with stakes, it slowed and exhausted intruders. Quirky tidbit: some castles stocked their moats with fish, providing food during sieges and a deterrent to uninvited swimmers. You probably wouldn't survive attempting to wade through one. But it's a reminder that practicality and psychological warfare often blend seamlessly. You climb a spiral staircase in the secondary tower, noting the clockwise design that favors defenders. The stairs twist unpredictably, manipulating movement and control. Narrow passages prevent large numbers from advancing together, while subtle widening at key points allows defenders to maintain leverage. Historians still argue how widely this design was applied, but the principle is clear. Architecture shapes the flow of combat almost as much as the weapons themselves. Reaching the battlements, you peer across the battlescape, overlapping walls, interspersed towers, and the far-reaching terrain. The castle doesn't merely defend a point, it dominates the landscape. Visibility, elevation, and structure converge to create a fortress that's both intimidating and nearly impregnable. Quirky fact: some towers included tiny observation niches that allowed a single person to surveil multiple approaches undetected. You probably wouldn't survive being caught by someone hiding there, but it's a clever touch of strategic deception. The armory in the secondary tower reinforces this layered genius. Weapons are stored not only for immediate access, but also to complement the positions outside. Archers, swordsmen, and defenders have coordinated paths, ensuring every move is optimized. Historians still debate whether such coordination was always systematically planned or developed organically through trial and error. Yet the overall effect is devastatingly effective. You walk along the top of the curtain wall, fingers grazing the worn stone. Small grooves for scaffolding, hooks for ropes, and subtle indentations reveal centuries of maintenance and ingenuity. The castle isn't static. It's been adapted, improved, and modified in response to evolving threats. Quirky tidbit: some castles even had removable stone sections for rapid repairs or temporary modifications during sieges. You probably wouldn't survive testing one without warning, but it shows a foresight that borders on brilliance. As dusk deepens into night, the shadows stretch long and dark, emphasizing the castle's towering presence. You realize that every angle, every hidden chamber, every defensive quirk contributes to a multi-layered survival strategy. Life inside the castle is a constant negotiation between comfort, logistics, and defense. Even mundane features, doors, windows are carefully orchestrated to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Finally, you pause at the top of the main tower, looking outward. The castle dominates the horizon, a sentinel of centuries, a monument to both human ingenuity and the persistent need for security. The genius of medieval architecture isn't merely in walls and battlements. It's in the interplay of space, psychology, and survival. Frozen in stone, echoing in the wind, and whispering across centuries. You descend slowly from the heights of the main tower, letting your hands trace the familiar grooves and chips in the stone, worn smooth by centuries of human touch. The castle feels almost alive around you, a network of walls, towers, staircases, and hidden chambers that breathe strategy, control, and survival into every corner. You begin to realize that the genius of these fortresses is not limited to their defensive or residential functions. It's in the holistic orchestration of life, threat, and human behavior. Walking through the inner courtyard, you notice how carefully pathways and open spaces are arranged. Attackers would have been funneled along predictable routes, while defenders could move freely, unseen or protected. Quirky fact: some courtyards included subtle depressions or mounds that disrupted siege equipment or slowed cavalry, turning the ground itself into a defensive asset. You probably wouldn't survive under a cavalry charge here, but the ingenuity is undeniable. You move into one of the residential wings, observing fireplaces, small chambers, and storage niches. These spaces were cozy, surprisingly functional, and designed with both comfort and security in mind. Historians still argue how much daily life influenced architectural choices versus military necessity. But standing here, you sense the careful balancing act. Tapestries insulate cold stone walls, and small windows are positioned for light and ventilation, but never at the expense of defense. Venturing into a spiral staircase, you notice its precise twist, designed to favor defenders while hindering attackers. Some stairs even include slight irregularities, forcing intruders into awkward movements and limiting the speed of ascent. Quirky fact: in some castles, staircases were widened strategically in places where guards might need to maneuver heavy equipment, blending practicality with combat advantage. You probably wouldn't survive rushing through without paying attention to every step, but it's a subtle reminder of medieval foresight. At the gatehouse, you pause to examine the layers of defense: drawbridge, portcullis, murder hole, and overlapping walls. Attackers would face an orchestrated gauntlet of threats, each element amplifying the others. The gatehouse isn't just a physical barrier, it's a psychological tool, projecting power and inducing hesitation. Historians still debate how much this design relied on standardized principles versus local innovation. But it's clear that effectiveness was paramount. Moving toward outer towers, you observe how overlapping fields of fire cover every approach. Machicolations, arrow slits, and hidden niches allow defenders to manipulate attackers' movements while remaining largely invisible. Quirky fact: some towers included small niches for signaling across walls, using flags, lights, or even mirrors, coordinating defense silently across vast spaces. You probably wouldn't survive standing too close during a skirmish, but the communication network is fascinating. Inside the armory, rows of weapons gleam dimly in the evening light, meticulously organized for rapid deployment. Each weapon is positioned to complement the surrounding defenses, ensuring defenders can react instantly. Historians still argue whether such organization was universal or adapted locally, but the combination of precision, efficiency, and foresight is unmistakable. As you wander through hidden passages and secret chambers, you marvel at the subtlety of design. False doors, concealed recesses, and escape routes demonstrate the architect's deep understanding of human psychology and movement. Quirky fact: some secret chambers were so well hidden that even long-term residents sometimes forgot their existence, leaving them perfect for emergencies. You probably wouldn't survive stumbling into one unaware during a siege, but the ingenuity is undeniable. Stepping onto a battlement for one final view, you survey the entire complex: curtain walls, towers, gatehouses, moats, and courtyards, forming an interlocking system of survival and authority. Life, defense, and psychological control are interwoven into stone, timber, and mortar. Even as centuries have passed, the structure communicates its genius through shadow, angle, and spatial design. Finally, as twilight settles and the wind softens, you feel the hum of history around you. The castle is more than architecture. It's a testament to human ingenuity, a living chronicle of survival, creativity, and subtle power. You leave the fortress with a quiet sense of awe, reminded that these stone giants were as much about the mind as the body, as much about influence as protection. They weren't merely buildings. They were enduring symbols of strategy, adaptation, and vision. Now, let your thoughts drift gently across the castle's walls, winding staircases, and quiet courtyards. Picture the sun slipping below the horizon, painting the towers in shades of gold and shadow, and feel the cool air brushing your face, as though centuries of stone are exhaling a calm sigh. The fortress, once alive with the clatter of soldiers, the murmur of residents, and the scrape of carts, is now quiet, still standing, patient and serene. Imagine the subtle dance of daily life unfolding within its walls. A cook tending the hearth, a guard tracing the spiral staircase, a lord gazing across the moat, and all of it orchestrated within a structure designed for survival, ingenuity, and rhythm. Every corner, every niche, every arrow slit contributed to a larger harmony that balanced defense and domestic life, danger and calm. Even the quirky touches, the hidden chambers, secret passageways, and clever grooves in the stone whisper stories of human cleverness and whimsy. Feel yourself slowing down with the castle, your own heartbeat sinking to the rhythm of centuries past. The complexity and genius of the design no longer intimidates, it soothes. You can almost hear the soft echo of footsteps long gone, the gentle murmur of voices, the faint creak of wooden hoardings, and it feels like a lullaby composed of stone and memory. As you sink deeper into this calm, let go of tension. Imagine yourself leaning against the cool walls, tracing the worn edges with your fingers, and let the castle's quiet wisdom envelop you. With each breath, you carry a fragment of its enduring ingenuity, a whisper of medieval life and survival, and a gentle reminder that even in stone there is warmth, care, and thoughtfulness. Good night, sweet dream.